Hi class, and welcome to Module 6. Module 6 covers Chapter 7 in the Breiman textbook. And in Chapter 7, Breiman gives sort of this big picture overview of some of the issues that we think about in quantitative research. The way that he lays out this particular chapter and these sections was honestly one of my hesitations in choosing this particular textbook. The main thing that I'll cover in this chapter is the measurement component, conceptualization, operationalization, and measurement of the concepts that we examine in research. And then he goes on to talk about sampling in chapter 8, and then comes back to some of the assessment and instrumentation issues that I think are directly related to the operationalization and measurement issues that he brings up in this chapter. So I'm going to follow what he does and talk a bit about measurement and defining concepts and measuring concepts in this lecture, and then we're going to come back to some of these issues in Module 8 after we talk about sampling. So we'll go in the order that he has things laid out, and let me know how that feels and how that works out for you. I think that there is some natural separation in the way that he lays this out, but in the way that I have typically taught this, I've typically done the conceptualization and operationalization piece in with the logistics of asking questions and conducting interviews. So let me know how it feels for you, if it feels disjointed at all, and we'll go from there. So as I mentioned, I'm primarily going to cover the measurement piece in this chapter. I really like that he covers the replication component. It goes back to the John Oliver clip that I asked you guys to watch at the beginning of the summer semester, and sort of touches on the difficulty with conducting replication research. Although I think for many of you, replication research is a really interesting way to go about thinking about a dissertation. I know for most of you that's not terribly interesting, particularly for those of you who might not go on and do other research. You want to do something that's very specific to you and to your interests. But I think dissertation phase research is a great place to conduct replication research. So he talks a bit about research and talks about causality and generalization. Both of those issues are issues that we'll come back to and continue talking about. For generalization particularly, we'll talk about that in the next chapter when we talk about sampling. So I'm really going to focus on measurement piece here. And I think for measurement, I'll say a couple of really broad things, and then I'll go into some details. The good research typically involves using valid and reliable measures developed from clearly defined concepts. That's sort of the take-home message of this lecture and of this chapter in a nutshell. And I think I've said this before, and I'll say it again, but as far as research goes, if we put garbage in, we get garbage out. So the way that we define and measure these concepts and think about these concepts really impact the results that we get and the conclusions that we can make from our research, which I'll talk about more in just a minute. So I'm going to talk a little bit about choosing measures and indicators. In a lot of research, there's really simple ways to measure things. They're very direct measures of height, of weight, of time. Those have very direct measures associated with them, metrics that we all understand. But in sexuality research and social science research, we measure things, and I've shown you this slide before, so you're familiar with this. We measure things like HIV risk, family connectedness, love, sexual behavior, things that often can't be directly measured or observed. And so we have to define what we're talking about when we talk about each of these concepts, and we have to then create or construct a measure that is appropriate to that concept. So we may define family connectedness and then think about the different kinds of indicators of family connectedness that we would then actually assess to be able to create a score for people on family connectedness. In sexuality, we have a lot of different concepts that we try and measure. Psychosocial kinds of concepts like sexual satisfaction or sexual assertiveness, which we'll talk about much more both in this lecture and obviously over the course of the semester. We assess sexual behavior, which seems like it might be a bit more directly measurable, but that's a rather complicated thing to measure as well. We have behavioral concepts that we also measure, like sexual risk, which then has to be defined, and we have to decide how to assess that. Physical health and functioning, like STI status, blood flow, muscle response, some of those things do have a bit more direct measurement available. Social context, like families, relationships, peer networks, things like that. So there are a lot of really complex constructs and concepts that we try to assess in sexuality research and in social science research. And so these are really challenging to try and define and measure. And so as we're building concepts, I think of this in three steps. So the first is conceptualization. In plain English, what does that concept mean? So for example, self-esteem means having a favorable opinion of oneself. And then we want to operationalize that concept. And operationalization involves defining a concept for the purposes of our study. So for example, self-esteem includes feeling worth, believing you have good qualities, believing you're able to do things well, etc. And then the third step is really thinking about the measurement or the way that we're going to indicate that concept. And so this is a specific measure of concept components. So for example, on a scale of 1 to 7, to what extent do you agree with the statement, I have many good qualities? Often on self-esteem scales or measures, there are several items that we put together to develop a total score, which I'll talk about more. So an indicator, as your book talks about, is something that is devised or perhaps already exists, and it's employed as though it were a measure of a concept. So we typically, indicator is a very particular word. Sometimes you'll hear people use that word. Often you'll hear people say a measure. And so an indicator is a measure of a concept. And so I usually say measure. So we'll all just understand that while we can't directly measure things like sexual guilt or satisfaction, we are developing measures of that concept. And those measures are produced by the operational definition of a concept, and many measures are actually multiple indicator measures, and that concept may have different dimensions that we want to capture. I'll give you an example on the sexual assertiveness scale in just a minute. And single indicators may capture only a portion of the underlying concept or maybe too general, so there are a variety of reasons why we want to use perhaps multiple indicator measures. And most measures, in fact, most measures, scales, indicators consist of multiple items, and typically those items are summed or averaged to create a score on that concept. And when we come back to the end of the semester and we start talking about SPSS, we'll be able to see how this plays out in a data set and how this actually looks and how we do this. So we're just laying the groundwork for that later work. So for example, sexual esteem. This is from the Snell Sexual Self-Awareness Questionnaire. So these are these 5 items that are designed to measure the concept of sexual esteem. And so you're supposed to go through and answer each of these 5 items using the response options here. Not at all characteristic of me, slightly characteristic of me, somewhat, moderately, and very characteristic of me. And there are these 5 items here. And so you would take the response that you get on each of these items and add those up, and that would give you a total sexual esteem score. And each of your respondents would have a score, and you would be able to look at that variability and either predict that variability or use that variability to predict another variable or behavior. And the main thing I want to say about this, which I already said a moment ago, is that our choices of indicators directly influence our results and conclusions. There are a couple of really good examples that I'll talk about. The first is sexual assault. I'm not sure how many of you have read the book Flirting with Danger. Lynn Phillips is a sociologist, I believe, at NYU. And she talks a lot about research that was inspired by her conducting research with college women about sexual violence. And she would find that so few of them would actually check off on a scale or on a survey that they'd ever been sexually assaulted or raped. But then when she would talk to them in qualitative interviews, they would describe situations that actually met the legal definition of sexual assault or rape. And so her book talks a lot about how how women navigate and negotiate these situations and relationships. And she also talked about how unwilling many people are to define a sexual experience as rape or as sexual assault. And so that has implications for how we measure sexual assault. A recent article came out in the Journal of Sex Research looking at item wording. And so they were particularly interested in the perpetration of sexual assault and how both women and men interpreted the items related to perpetration of sexual assault. And she found that there were gender differences in how men and women interpreted those items, and that the wording of those items impacted the interpretation and response to those items. So how we word things, how we name things, all really matter in the self-report often of these particular behaviors. And that has direct implications for prevalence rates, for understanding what predicts sexual assault, for understanding the consequences of sexual assault. And so these have very real impacts on the conclusions that we make and the practice that we derive from those conclusions. Another example that I'll talk about is sexual assertiveness, which we'll obviously be spending a lot of time talking about this semester. And for the first of these two slides that I'll talk about sexual assertiveness, I'll give you some definitions, both some conceptual and some operational definitions from several articles. These articles are all uploaded in shared files on Campus Cruiser, which will give you a little bit of a jump start in doing some lit review around sexual assertiveness. So Santos Iglesias, who is a Spanish researcher who's done a lot of work around sexual assertiveness, says sexual assertiveness is a social skill that involves exhibiting assertive behaviors in sexual situations. It's a pretty straightforward definition. Morikoff, in their earlier work around creating a sexual assertiveness scale, operationalizes sexual assertiveness as strategies used to accomplish goals of sexual autonomy. So in some ways that's more specific, and in other ways that's more vague, I think. And a more recent article that didn't look at the measurement per se of sexual assertiveness, but talks about some relationships between sexual assertiveness and other variables, defines sexual assertiveness as being able to recognize, prioritize, and express one's own limits, needs, and desires in sexual situations. So very similar to that first definition in a lot of ways. This article, which I've actually added to the reading list for this week's module, tries to really pull together a lot of the existing scales that we use to measure sexual assertiveness and think about developing a comprehensive measure. So their operationalization of sexual assertiveness really combines the ways in which other people have defined sexual assertiveness as a commitment to employ appropriate contraception, the ability to initiate sex with a partner, the ability to refuse unwanted sex, the capacity to communicate sexual desires and satisfaction, and or the ability to discuss sexual history with the sexual partner. So it's a very specific operationalization of that construct or that concept. And I won't spend a lot of time talking about each of these scales right now. I think the article that I've added to this week's module does a really nice job of giving an overview of some of those scales and talks a little bit about how they improved upon or believe that they improved upon that scale. But sexual assertiveness is often thought of as having multiple dimensions. That there is initiation of wanted sexual experience, refusal of unwanted sexual experience, and then sexual assertiveness around the prevention of pregnancy or STDs, or what's sometimes called condom insistence. And so the sexual assertiveness scale measures these three dimensions. The Hurlburt Index of Sexual Assertiveness measures these dimensions as well as a communication component. The article also talks about the assertive sexual communication scale, which is not one that I've ever seen mentioned before in my reading around this area. And then the article that I'll have you read is a conceptualization of the sexual assertiveness questionnaire. So I think that article is a nice complement to this week's reading because it talks a little bit about some of the reliability and validity issues around measuring sexual assertiveness, as well as how we think about defining and operationalizing this particular construct. So I'll be curious to hear when we talk more in class or via message boards what you all think of this article and if that helps at all to sort of demonstrate some of the issues that we're talking about. So I want to walk you through an example that I think maybe will be helpful in thinking about how we operationalize and define some of these concepts. So if we proposed this research question, what is the association between exposure to sexually explicit media and masculinity ideology? If this were a question that we were posing, we would have a lot to think about in terms of how we are defining and operationalizing these constructs. So our predictor variable in this situation, what we're thinking about as a predictor variable in this situation, although if this were cross-sectional research, we couldn't really talk a whole lot about causal associations, which this chapter does talk a little bit about thinking about causality. So if this were a longitudinal study and we could measure exposure to sexuality, sexually explicit media or material, and then measure later masculinity ideology, we could think a little bit more about causation. But let's think sort of more broadly or conceptually as exposure to sexually explicit media as our independent or predictor variable, and masculinity ideology as our outcome variable, what we're trying to predict by understanding exposure to sexual explicit media. So our predictor variable is exposure to sexually explicit media here. And we want to operationalize exposure, and we could define it in the following way. Lots of ways we could define this. So frequency of exposure to video or photographic depictions of sexual images of women and or depictions of sexual behavior. And you could think about how strict you would want to make that definition. Would looking at Playboy pictures, although they're not showing nudes anymore, would looking at penthouse pictures, for example, count as exposure to sexually explicit media? Or would you want it to be video? Would it need to have more than one person involved in it? This is obviously conceptualized in a more heterosexual way. So would it be sexual images of women? Would it have to depict sexual behavior, or could they just be naked women or scantily clad women? And so you'd have to think about how we would want to operationalize that exposure. So what counts as sexually explicit material? Magazines, videos, animated versus real. What about sexual content in video games? How broad do we want to make this conceptualization? We also would have to think about time frame and the exposure component. So maybe we're talking about ever, recently. We'd have to think about how recently that were. And then we'd have to think about the level of measurement. And I haven't gone into this level of measurement component yet. And I'll probably save that for the latter part of the class when we start talking about SPSS. So don't worry about this first part, the ordinal outcome. Just know that when we're thinking about level of measurement, we would want to think about how we want to measure this. So would we want to say, I want to have an ordinal outcome that we can have people choose from different categories, such as 0 times, 1 to 3 times per week, 4 to 6 times per week, every day. And we could say in the last 3 months. On average, how many times have you watched whatever our definition is up here? Would we want to get some more refined measure of this and try and get people to assess the number of times per week, the number of hours per week they spent engaged with sexually explicit media, using our definition of sexually explicit media? So there's a lot of things to think about in just this very basic way of thinking about exposure to sexually explicit media. And then we'd also think about how we wanted to measure that. Would that be a self-report measure using some of these decisions that we made up here? There's certainly problems with memory when we get into self-report, social desirability bias, particularly around this particular topic. Would we want to look at somebody's weblog, have them bring in their computer or give us access somehow and be able to look at internet records to be able to see what they actually looked at? That would certainly give us some sense, though a lot of people look now on their phone, so that might not give us a full sense. We could then code pages as explicit or not. We can measure the amount of time that somebody viewed these pages and get a really precise measurement of actual time spent viewing. And so there's a whole lot to think about, even in just this very simple question, sort of 2-variable question that we want to think about. And then when we think about our outcome as masculinity ideology, we want to think about how we'd want to measure that. So there are a variety of researchers who've developed their own measures. Portia and Tolman define this as endorsement of normative conceptions of male behavior and roles. Would we want to find or create a measure appropriate to the research question and sample? There's a variety of choices that we could use, like male role attitude scale, the adolescent masculinity ideology and relationship scale. If we were to use that one and we wanted to use it with adult men, would we have to think a little bit more about how we might need to adapt that if it was developed with the sample of adolescents? And then we have to think about reliability and validity issues. So your book talks a little bit about this, and I think that that people tend to struggle with some of these concepts. So I'll talk about them a little bit more here, and then we can certainly talk about them in class more, and we'll come back to these issues towards the end of the semester as we start looking at the data that we collect. So there are a couple different ways of thinking about reliability that we'll focus on and that are most relevant to most researchers. Stability refers to the extent to which a measure provides the same result each time it's used. And people typically examine this by administering the same test or scale or measure to the same sample at 2 points in time. That kind of test-retest reliability makes an assumption that that construct or that concept is relatively stable over time. And so we'd have to think about, for example, if we administered sexual assertiveness scales and then administered those scales again 2 months later, we'd have to assume that sexual assertiveness is a characteristic that wouldn't change much over the course of 2 months or 3 months or whatever our test-retest window is. That certainly works less well for things like behavior, and I'll talk about that a bit more. So if you ask somebody the number of partners they've had in the last 3 months, you couldn't ask them that again and then say, oh, well, they had a different number, so the measurement of the number of sexual partners isn't reliable. That 3-month window is a very different window, and so we're not looking at the same measurement here. So this is this stability is more often used for more psychological or psychosocial kinds of constructs. The other kind of reliability that we're concerned with is internal consistency reliability. And this refers to the consistency with which the items in a scale measure the same construct. They may measure different dimensions of a construct, but overarching are all those items tapping into the same construct or concept. And so if the scale items are tapping into a unitary construct, they should be correlated with one another. And I know we haven't talked about correlation yet, but correlation is this measure of basically the overlap between two different variables. In this case, is 2 different items. So there are a couple of different methods. Your book talks about both of those. It talks about the split half method in the actual text, and then it has a little box that talks about Cronbach's alpha. And so you can read about those, and we'll use the Cronbach's alpha when we assess reliability for the data that we collect. And so, as I mentioned before, we have to think a little bit more carefully about reliability for behavioral measures. So, for example, if we developed a scale of sexual risk behavior, and there are several people who've done this, and some of the items on the scale ask about consistency of condom use. Some of them may ask about communicating with partners ahead of time. Some of them may ask about having sex with partners who are injection drug users or have engaged in sex work. And so we wouldn't necessarily make the assumption that all people would respond in the same way to all of those items. Somebody may say, I never use condoms, or I'm super inconsistent about using condoms, but I never have sex with injection drug users or sex workers. And so even though those individual items on that scale are not necessarily correlated with one another, we wouldn't necessarily worry about that for a scale like that. So again, reliability is in both stability and internal consistency tends to be more useful in situations in which we're measuring psychological or psychosocial sorts of constructs. All right, so now we'll talk about validity. And we talked before about internal and external validity. So internal validity, again, is the extent to which we're able to derive clear causal conclusions from our study. External validity is the extent to which we're able to generalize to a specific population or other populations beyond those involved in our study. But what we're talking about here is measurement validity. And validity, when we're talking about a measure, it refers to the extent that a scale or an index is measuring the construct it's intended to measure. And I probably should have said this earlier, but people often use the term construct and concept interchangeably. As you'll see when we get to the next slide about the kinds of measurement validity, there are a lot of terms that people use in research that vary a little bit. This makes me a little bit crazy sometimes that we'll have the same term that or the same idea that we're talking about, and different kinds of researchers will refer to it in different ways. So whenever I go through some of these things, I'll try and say if there are other words that people use, other terms that people use for the same ideas. But again, validity refers to the extent that a scale or index is measuring the construct it's intended to measure. So measure validity, there are several different kinds. Your book talks about face validity, and so this is just on the face of it, does that scale appear to measure the concept that you think that it measures? Construct validity, your book also talks about this. I think his description of this is a little challenging, but and I think there's some overlap in some of these definitions, which I'll talk about in just a second. Construct validity is the extent to which a measure relates to measures of other constructs that you would theoretically expect it to correlate with. So, for example, if you're measuring sexual satisfaction, you would assume that sexual satisfaction would be correlated with relationship satisfaction. And so you could run that correlation and assess the overlap between those two measures to be able to say, all right, those are highly related, which makes me think that I'm actually tapping into sexual satisfaction when I'm measuring sexual satisfaction. Criterion validity is somewhat similar. The extent to which a behavior, the extent to which a measure is related to some criterion measure of that same phenomena. So this could be behavior or performance. Your book talks about concurrent validity and predictive validity. These are both ways of assessing criterion validity, which your book does not mention. And it mentions criterion, but criterion validity is this overarching way of thinking about assessing your measure and your concept as related to some other criterion measure of that same phenomena. So concurrent validity is the extent to which a measure relates to some criterion that's co-occurring in time, and predictive validity is the extent to which a measure relates to some criterion in the future. An example of this that's often used is how well the SAT predicts college success. And then understanding, do SAT scores then represent a valid measurement of intelligence? Convergent validity is the extent to which the measure is similar to other measures of the same concept using different methods. So for example, if we assess a particular thing in daily diary methods versus retrospective questionnaires, are those, we're assessing the same concept, but we're doing it in a couple of different ways using different methods. And so convergent validity asks us to look at the overlap between those two measurements, and that will help us decide about the validity of that measure. And your book does not mention this particular kind of validity. It's basically the opposite in some ways of convergent validity. Discriminant validity is the extent to which the measure is negatively associated with concepts you'd expect to be dissimilar. So this is similar to construct validity, in which we think that there will be an overlap or a correlation between measures that we theoretically expect the measure to correlate with. On the other hand, discriminant validity, we think that our measure would be negatively associated with a particular measure. So for example, if we're developing a measure of sexual anxiety, we would assume that sexual anxiety would be negatively associated with sexual satisfaction. So we would maybe measure both of those things using our new measure of sexual anxiety, and if we in fact find a negative correlation, that would provide some evidence for us that we're tapping into sexual anxiety, or at least something that negatively is correlated with sexual satisfaction. There's a lot of debate about how we name these concepts, how we think about them. This website is potentially useful to you that talks about some of these issues in much greater detail. And this is the section where he talks about measurement validity. So if that's at all helpful to you, or if you find yourself floundering around some of these issues still, that might be helpful for you to review some of that information. So validity and reliability certainly overlap, but they're not the same thing, and I think people get confused sometimes by these. So let's think a little bit about using this graphic. This is also from the Social Research Methods website, and I've seen this used before. I find it somewhat helpful. In his description of this, he says that imagine for each person you're measuring, you're taking a shot at the target. And so if you measure the concept perfectly for each person, you're hitting the center of the target, and if you don't, you're missing the center. So the more you're off for that person, the further you are from the center. And so he shows these 4 different scenarios, juxtaposing reliability and validity with one another. And so this first one, we have consistency over here. So we're hitting this consistency, but we're missing the center of the target. So this is when a measure is reliable but not valid. This is a situation when a measure is valid but not reliable. So these hits are all over the target. We rarely hit the center, which means that on average we're getting a decent score for the group overall, but for each individual person it's not so great. And so in that situation we have a somewhat valid group estimate, but we're inconsistent. And this third case over here, neither reliable nor valid. So our hits are spread across this target, we're fairly consistently missing the center, and we're not very consistent. And so we are neither reliable nor valid in this situation. This final one is kind of this perfect situation. We're consistent, all of the scores are clustered around the same area here, and they're hitting this target. I don't know if this graphic helps you at all. Let me know if that's helpful to you at all in helping to think about the overlap between reliability and validity. Your book mentions this, and I think it's worth repeating that validity presumes reliability. So if the measure isn't stable over time, it can't be valid. And so your book also gives, at the end, this sort of talking question to help think about some of these issues. So they say, Breiman says, whereas validity presupposes reliability, reliability does not presuppose validity. So discuss that quote. So this is a lot of information. The pieces that I really want you to focus on taking away from here are the importance of thinking through the concepts that you're interested in, thinking through the definitions of the concepts that you're interested in, and then thinking carefully about how we assess those concepts and how we actually measure these things. In Module 8, I'll talk a little bit more about creating questions, laying out questions in a survey, and how those factors will influence responses to those questions and then can have influences on reliability and validity. And towards the end of the semester, we'll actually look into assessing validity and reliability using the data that we've collected. So if you're not 100% getting these topics at this point, hopefully being able to apply them and see them at work will help you have a better grasp of them by the end of the semester. So don't freak out too much if you finish this chapter and finish the end of this lecture and still are thinking WTF. So check out the Social Research Methods website. I think some of these issues in particular are described fairly well there. He has fairly strong opinions about how we think about validity in particular. So that will give you some sense of some of the controversy that still exists among methodologists about how we think about these things. And as always, if you have questions, thoughts, post those under the general discussion forum. We'll also, in our first day of class and our first weekend, spend a little bit of time going over this material, answering questions, pulling it all together, making sure that we're all on the same page. But in the meantime, if you have questions or thoughts, definitely post those. All right, thanks.